Okay, welcome to everyone to this webinar, Financing the Transition Away from Fossil Fuels, otherwise known as TAF, Transition Away from Fossil Fuels, the Systemic Role of Central Banks. I'm delighted to welcome you all, whatever time zone you're in. I hope you're all keeping cool. Um, this is a webinar which is co-organized by the World Resources Institute and the Leave It in the Ground Initiative, LINGO. And my name is Nick Robbins. I lead the work on finance at WRI, and it's a real pleasure to doing this in partnership with Lingo, with Kjell Kuhne, and Kjell and I work together at the Santa Marta conference on the the central bank work stream. And we've got a fantastic set of panelists who are also involved in Santa Marta in this historic meeting, the first conference on the transition away from fossil fuels. And we're going to be focusing on the finance dimension, which is obviously crucial to mobilize finance away from fossil fuels, but also towards a prosperous and inclusive clean energy transition. So we know, I think, particularly from the crises we see in our global economy, particularly the war in the Gulf, that fossil fuels are also not just the primary cause of catastrophic climate change, but also now a structural source of economic and financial insecurity. What is interesting is obviously governments are very focused on this, and 57, 60 governments gathered in Santa Marta to focus on this and create a coalition of the doing, as the co-hosts Colombia and the Netherlands have put it. But also central banks are taking a focused role on this, as well as civil society, indigenous peoples, private sector, private finance, business, and so on. And I think the role of central banks in the transition away from fossil fuels is a new and potentially very positive development that we've seen in recent months. So in the next hour or so, we're going to look at this challenge, look at the challenge we face. Obviously, this is a year of crisis. We have a fossil fuel driven energy crisis, driven by conflict, but also we're seeing the growing threat of harm and damage from climate shocks, which unfortunately is going to be exacerbated later in the year with the El Nino event. So to help us answer these questions and also help sort of give guidance about what we can do and how central banks can play their role within their mandate, we have a fantastic set of guests and speakers. We have Frank van der Vleuten, who is the Coordinating Policy Officer for International Climate Finance in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Netherlands. And as I mentioned, the Netherlands was one of the co-hosts of the first Transition Away from Fossil Fuels conference in Colombia and Santa Marta. So very much welcome to you, Frank. Great you could spend time with us today. We then have Sarah Amorim Torres, who is the Deputy Advisor for Prudential and Foreign Exchange Regulation Department at the Banco Central do Brazil. Welcome, Sarah. It was great to have you in Santa Marta, and it's very good to have you today, joining us with your perspectives and expertise. Djwala Rambaran, former governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, one of the core members of the Santa Marta Transition and Financial Stability Group, which was set up at Santa Marta. Very good to have you with us, Djwala. I always learn a lot from your long experience on central banking issues. Isabel Gianni Zhang, who's a fellow at the Council on Economic Priorities in Switzerland. And it was great to co-chair the process with you, Isabel, in Santa Marta, and to have your insights and expertise. And good to have you here today. And then Kjell Kuhne, Director of the Leave It in the Ground Initiative. And Kjell, it's been very good working with you, and long may that continue. So before we get into the panel, I just wanted to really just give a sort of 4 or so sort of contextual remarks really about the agenda we have. Transition away from fossil fuels, how do we mobilize finance, and then the role of central banks, where central banks can play a positive role. So the first is about mandates. Central banks have very specific mandates, which are given to them by governments. And that is very important about the actions that they can take. And as I said earlier, I think we're recognizing that fossil fuels are now systemic sources of economic insecurity and financial instability, both because of conflict-driven disruption, and sadly that seems to be quite systematic. It's not just this year. Obviously, we saw the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and that's stretching all the way back to the 1970s. And this matters for central banks, particularly for the core mandates of price and financial stability, as well as the wider mandates that specific countries can have for financial inclusion and sustainable development. And just to give a sense of the reactions that are now coming from central banks, which are not represented on the panel, which I'm going to mention them, from the European Central Bank, board member Frank Elderson wrote in the Financial Times just before the Santa Marta conference, interesting that Europe's fossil fuel dependence poses risks to price stability. So again, you have this issue of fossil fuel dependence, and the core mandate, the primary mandate of the European Central Bank is price stability, and now these two issues are becoming connected. And what are the implications of that? Second, in June last month, Swati Dhingra, who is an external member of the Bank of England, professor at LSE, and she was speaking at an event hosted by WRI in London, and in a very analytical set of remarks. She suggested a number of things. Firstly, that I suppose, add to what Frank was saying when he was saying fossil fuel dependence can be a risk to price stability. Swati was saying the green transition can support price stability. So again, an interesting add there. But also adding that there were potential issues that monetary tightening could slow the green transition. For example, because, and I quote, higher interest rates could disproportionately increase the cost of renewable energy investment, as these technologies are highly capital intensive. So again, we're having some interesting comments from central banks looking at what this issue of fossil fuel dependence means for their mandates. And so it's a very, very timely discussion. So that's the first question of mandate. The second, I mean, in the introduction to this session, we've talked about the systemic roles of central banks, and I think central banks are keystone institutions in the national economies and also in the global economy. And positively, and I think this is something that was recognized very much at the Santa Marta meeting, over the past decade, central banks have increasingly taken an active role in responding to the financial risks of climate change and increasingly nature degradation, and also supporting the greening of the financial system. What is interesting is how this question of fossil fuel dependence broadens this climate risk agenda. And as I've suggested, overcoming this dependence means accelerating an orderly and a just transition to clean energy across the economy, and obviously thinking about other value chains, particularly into agriculture and so on. And for me, if we step back, it means when we're thinking about fossil fuels dependence, there are perhaps four forces for the fossil fuel transition. The first is health. And this is often the first in many countries, my own, the UK, but I think in China and many other countries, that the burning of fossil fuels contributes to air pollution, which is a severe impact on human health. About a fifth of deaths in the world now are linked to air pollution from fossil fuels. And that's about 2 million people alone in India. So that's a reason, not necessarily a stability reason for central banks, but a powerful reason for policy action. Then we have energy security. Obviously, we have that challenge now this year, sadly, but this does go back to the 1973 oil shock and the 1979 oil shock, and this means that fossil fuels we need to recognise as a persistent driver of instability, and in a sense, potentially clean energy can be a supportive factor for stability, the primary goal of central banks. That's the second factor. Then, of course, we have climate shocks, which are primarily driven by greenhouse gases generated from the combustion of fossil fuels. And this obviously leads into health impacts, economic and environmental implications. And as I mentioned, sadly, we have the oncoming El Nino set of extreme weather events later this year. And finally, cost, obviously. And the falling costs of clean tech mean that clean electrification of power, of buildings, transport, and industry are very attractive to many countries. But we have the availability and the cost of capital is a major constraint. We know particularly in developing economies, and therefore what role can central banks, particularly in their role in monetary policy, but also other policies, what role can they play within their mandate around cost? So that's the second point. The third is obviously we're in a very diverse world, and there are diverse contexts and transition opportunities and threats vary greatly across the world. Central banks operate in very different political, economic contexts, and one central bank does in one country may be done by another institution in another country, and so on. So we've got to recognize that diversity. What was interesting when we met in Santa Marta in the central bank work stream of the Science and Policy Conference is recognizing that there is probably quite a broad set of tools that could be relevant for the agenda we're discussing today. So we've mentioned before, firstly, monetary policy and interest rates. Secondly, financial stability and prudential supervision. So how central banks supervise particular financial institutions, the commercial banking sector, sometimes the pension sector, insurance companies, and particularly how this issue of fossil fuel dependence may relate to transition plans that banks may have. So that's the second issue. There's research and evaluation of statistics, which is often overlooked, I think. And this is a very powerful role that central banks can play in terms of their macroeconomic and other forms of analysis. There's the portfolios that central banks have for monetary and other things, and they have their own assets and how they can be aligned with the transition away from fossil fuels. There's other mandates, and maybe Dwala, you can look at this for us, which is around financial inclusion and how central banks can play that role in widening inclusion for households, for individuals, for small businesses. And then obviously there is international cooperation, and this has been a great area of I think, success in the central banking arena. The Network for Greening the Financial System, now 152 central banks around the world, and the Alliance of Financial Inclusion as well. So some really good things. And then the final piece is the value of multi-stakeholder international cooperation. So the Santa Marta conference, which Frank will talk about briefly in a few minutes. Before that, we had a science and policy conference, and members of the panel were all involved in the pre-conference and the work stream on central banks. And after that, we decided to set up the Santa Marta Transition and Financial Stability Group. It's an informal group. And the mission is really to be a community of practice to deepen the research, the dialogue, the capacity building and action around the role of central banks in the transition away from fossil fuels. And to do that particularly in line with central bank mandates, as I mentioned, which is absolutely essential. So price stability, financial stability, and wider mandates as well. And we are determined in this informal community of practice not to reinvent the wheel, but really to identify areas that we can practically serve the Santa Marta countries and beyond with insights and convening and dialogue. So this session is really to help identify how that sort of multi-stakeholder cooperation can go forward. And so with those opening remarks, what I'd like to do is maybe hand over to you, Frank, part of the one of the co-chairs, the Dutch government, which co-chaired the central bank process, and give us an insight of, now we're a few months on, you released the comprehensive report, some of the key outcomes, the momentum you see, and particularly the areas you see are particularly relevant in terms of the mobilization of finance. So Frank, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you for bringing this webinar together. It's very important, it's very timely that we take this on. I wanted to start with the main message coming out of the Santa Marta dialogue discussions, which was basically that transitioning away from fossil fuels is not only a climate or energy issue, but it's a broad development challenge, it's a trade challenge, it's a structural economic transformation challenge. The transition cannot be understood as simply replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy, but it really requires a broader transformation of economies, institutions, investment patterns, and trade structures. The related important conclusion, and I think you alluded to that, is that when it comes to such complex long-term transition processes, there's really a major need and demand for exchange and cooperation internationally, and like you said, among a coalition of doers. How do you actually take this forward? The Santa Marta coalition that gathered in Colombia consists of 57 countries, but also 13 stakeholder groups. I was impressed, like you, by the science meeting, but in particular also by the People's Summit, the academia, financial institutions, the children, the private sector. what was really remarkable, the atmosphere was very positive, momentum was very impressive. So I think, as an overall, that's what I try to take forward from this. The Netherlands stepped into the role of co-hosting with Colombia, where we had an excellent cooperation, because we felt a more serious discussion actually is needed on how do you transition away from fossil fuel in a responsible and well-planned way. We did not foresee at the time that this would take the center stage of geopolitics, and it would even become more urgent due to the disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz and the Iran war. But what is crystal clear, and what has been crystal clear, is that the world needs to move towards more resilient, more diversified, more sustainable energy systems with a sense of urgency. So like I mentioned, coalition in Santa Marta was a coalition of doers. The outcome, and as you can see from the co-host report that was published, this was not a negotiated text. This was really taking stock of the exchange that took place. At the London Climate Action Week a couple of weeks ago, 3 power ladies were on the stage together. I thought this was really an excellent presentation of the spirit of Santa Marta. The 2 ministers, plus Anna Tony as COP30 CEO, jointly taking this report, but also calling on all of us to make sure that we take this momentum forward, and we make it count. So we try to add meaningful deliverables to the momentum. I think that's an interesting and very important challenge. Very concretely, Tuvalu and Ireland announced that they will host a second conference next year. And we defined 3 work streams to help keep the momentum going and to arrive at meaningful results and insights that we can contribute to the second conference, but also, in the meantime, really make a change in the real economy as much as we can. We intend to share the 3 workstream information on the 3 work streams in a public webinar by the end of the month. We'll come shortly with the exact date and time, but that's coming. I can give you a peek preview. The first one is on national roadmaps for the transition away from fossil fuels, where the aim is to help on a technical level and with peer learning on how do you actually develop a longer-term roadmaps to do this, working closely with the NDC partnership, but also with the Science Panel for the Global Energy Transition to support countries and still in all of this work, make sure we have a solid science base that we work from. The second work stream touches closer, I think in a closer way to what we're discussing today. It deals with the deeper analysis of the macroeconomic dependencies that hinder the transition. So in Santa Marta, we discussed the so-called debt trap, the finance trap, and the subsidy trap. This work stream will be led by IISD and will focus on practical solutions to fiscal constraints, fossil fuel subsidies, broader structural barriers, but it will also importantly look at what we can improve together within national and international financial architecture to accelerate financing of real and meaningful action and avoid continuing lock-ins. The third work stream will focus on strengthening cooperation models between producer and consumer countries to support more sustainable and diversified economic models. So to succeed in the transition, obviously, we need to look at building mutually beneficial green markets, have the demand creation work for clean technologies, at regional economic diversification, avoid new dependencies, and all of that work. In this third work stream, the OECD will take sort of that coordinating role and making sure that everybody can cooperate. Final point, Nick, is across all 3 work streams, we want to have very clear guiding principles. One is build as much as we can on existing initiatives, avoid duplication, not creating all types of new structures, but really work from existing cooperation and amplify them. Second, ensuring broad participation, including from stakeholders from the Global South, making sure that actually this is informed by all stakeholders that have something to contribute. And in relation to that, we are very committed that the Coalition of the Doers really will remain open and flexible. And we hope all around the table today that have something to contribute can really contribute in a meaningful way. I'm very committed to work on this and look forward to our discussions today and to the further work in the coming period. Back to you, Nick.
Well, thanks, and thanks very much for your commitment. And I think, in light of what you just said, I think let's move from the global north to the global south, to you, Sarah, and actually following on really directly from the context you set, the geopolitical context you set, Frank. And this is something that we really explored together, Sarah. But really, in light of this Middle East conflict which we're facing, how does this question of fossil fuel dependency differentially impact macroeconomic stability, financial stability, and so on, of net importing countries versus net exporting emerging market developing economies? There's a major dimension of understanding this issue. Maybe if you could give some thoughts on that, Sarah, to kick off.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Nick, for having me here today. 5 months into the Middle East conflict, the global economy has managed to cope with the oil shock better than they initially feared. In fact, so far we have seen limited evidence of second-round effects. A more severe spike in global energy prices was largely prevented by 3 factors: a strategic inventory drawdowns, increased production outside the Gulf, and broad efforts to dampen oil demand. While the economic impact of this geopolitical conflict is global, reverberating through commodity prices, inflation expectations, and financial conditions, it remains highly asymmetric, as you stated in your question. The current shock exposes energy importers more than exporters, poorer nations more than wealthy ones, and those with meager policy buffers more than those with ample reserves. Emerging market and developing economies, including Chile, Egypt, India, Pakistan, and Thailand, that are large net energy importers, incur high economic costs relative to their GDPs, accounting for at least 3% of their GDPs. The vulnerability to rising import costs is particularly severe in nations with limited financing capacity or substantial current account deficits, such as Pakistan. Conversely, importing countries running current account surpluses like Thailand face lower external financing risks, though longer high energy prices will increase fiscal strains for any government operating consumer subsidy regimes. Beyond energy concerns, supply chain issues caused intermittent shortages of fertilizers and key industrial inputs that are significantly affecting agriculture and manufacturing. Such disruptions coincide with the Northern Hemisphere planting season, jeopardizing crop yields and driving up food prices. Intermittent shortages in fertilizer and energy markets pose risks to food security and aggravate poverty, particularly in emerging market and developing economies, where fiscal space to counter the impact is more constrained. By contrast, net energy exporters outside the Middle East, including Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia, and Nigeria, benefit from favorable terms of trade, stronger currency performance, and export windfalls. These factors particularly cushion them against domestic inflationary pressures and elevated sovereign risk premium. Nonetheless, a prolonged supply shock could de-anchor inflation expectations, complicating the execution of monetary policy and undermining growth outcomes. In the end, whether an economy is temporarily supported by export windfalls or burdened by import costs, this conflict serves as a stark reminder of the inherent challenges that volatile energy commodity cycles and our continued dependence on fossil fuels pose to sustaining macroeconomic stability. In this landscape, the Central Bank of Brazil in the energy transition is fundamentally rooted in our mandate to safeguard price and financial stability. In a global economy fractured by geopolitical tensions and volatile energy costs, maintaining stability over the medium and long term is inseparable from advancing sustainability and gradually reducing domestic dependence on fossil fuels. Within this landscape, climate transition risks should not be seen as a deferred concern, but rather as systemic vulnerabilities that must be addressed now. Brazil presents a unique dual energy profile. On one hand, our electricity matrix is a world-class benchmark, powered by a remarkable 89% of renewables as of 2024. On the other hand, our logistics remain heavily reliant on fossil fuels due to road freight heavy-duty subsidies. Additionally, Brazil's oil and gas sector is crucially to our trade balance, accounting for 13.3% of total exports. While we are a significant crude oil exporter, we rely heavily on imports of natural gas and refined products like gasoline and diesel. This gap makes us vulnerable to global energy price fluctuations due to supply chain disruptions, as we're seeing in the Middle East conflict. These energy shocks transmit swiftly through our economy as a primary driver of cost-push inflation, triggering price fluctuations that cascade through a national supply chain heavily rely on road freight and imported fertilizers. In theory, central banks should look through short-lived supply-side shocks to keep inflation expectations anchored. However, this conventional wisdom is being challenged by frequent, persistent shocks fueled by escalating geopolitical tensions. In this fragmented geopolitical environment, monetary policy may need to adapt to heightened uncertainty. While most central banks in advanced economies use asset purchase as a standard monetary policy instrument, the Central Bank of Brazil has used them primarily for crisis management to support market liquidity, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic. Therefore, implementing flanking policies such as preferential interest rates to offset the disadvantages faced by renewable investments and boost them lies outside our mandate. The deployment of subsidies and concessional lending is the primary responsibility of our National Development Bank, called BNDES. Additionally, multilateral development banks can also play a complementary role by providing de-risking mechanisms, stabilizing markets, and catalyzing private capital for low-carbon investments. Another front tackled by BCB is the threats posed by the energy transition to the safety and soundness of individual banks. To prevent the so-called climate Minsky moment, which is a sudden, rapid, and systemic collapse in asset values driven by the abrupt correction of severely mispriced climate risks, we have updated our micro-prudential framework to integrate climate transition risks into banks' risk management frameworks, alongside traditional financial risks, such as credit, market, operational, and liquidity risks. This aims to ensure that high carbon exposures are appropriately priced. Under this framework, large-sized banks must employ climate scenario analysis to stress test their balance sheet resilience across a range of plausible futures, encompassing transition risks. As a final point, it is important to stress that the Central Bank of Brazil's approach to tackling climate change and consequently the energy transition remains firmly rooted in the principle that prudential regulation must be risk-based. Back to you, Nick.
Thank you so much. And there's a lot of richness there in what you said, Sarah, but I caught a couple of things. I think you said the climate transition is not a deferred concern. Very interesting, but a systemic vulnerability that must be addressed now. So I think very, very, very interesting. And then you talked both about the monetary point, but also in the stability point about the prudential policy. And that's something of great interest to me, particularly about transition plans that banks may have and so on. So I think hopefully we have a chance to pick that. But thanks very much. We're going to head a little bit to the north, but not to the global north. We're going to go to you, Djwala, now in Trinidad. And really maybe building on what we've heard both from Frank and also from Sarah from the central banking perspective. You've been a central bank governor yourself. You work very closely with other developing countries, small island developing states, and so on. Maybe give further insight into some of the particular issues facing these economies, and the need for finance and the role that central banks can play in this transition. Jwala, over to you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Nick, and certainly my pleasure to join this webinar with such distinguished colleagues. I think so far from the discussion, it's clear that central banks are increasingly recognized as key actors in enabling this transition away from fossil fuels. But what I've seen is that much of the prevailing discussions have been largely shaped by the institutional realities of advanced economies, and these economies have deep capital markets, strong monetary sovereignty, and relatively low sovereign risk. And of course, these conditions, these assumptions don't hold in small island developing states, particularly in the Caribbean, where I think I'm a little more able to speak on. And it's really in these countries where the transition is not constrained really by technology or policy gaps. It's really constrained by structural financial conditions. And I think this sort of also reflects on Frank's piece on where he spoke about the transition as part of a structural transformation. And why do I say that for SIDS? Because SIDS in general, particularly in the Caribbean, they do have high public debt. In the Caribbean, for example, the average public debt ratio is around 70% to GDP. Some countries actually have debt to GDP ratios beyond 100. There's acute climate vulnerability and, of course, strong environmental degradation associated with that. These countries also have really constrained fiscal space. And that I'll explain is why this is so critical. And financial systems, capital markets are, of course, shallow, not relatively well developed. And therefore, there's a high dependency on external capital. And what this means is therefore that for many SIDS in the Caribbean, the transition challenge is really embedded within what I would call a debt fossil fuel trap. Right. And let me explain, what that is. I think this analytical framework is really key to how we develop the transition pathway for these countries in the sense that there's no one size fits all. That debt fossil fuel trap starts something like this, where climate shocks and environmental degradation generate recurrent fiscal pressures. Climate shocks, for example, let's say we have a hurricane like Hurricane Melissa that hit Jamaica late last year, that depresses output, but most importantly, the reconstruction part is financed by borrowing, and mainly borrowing on relatively expensive terms. And what that borrowing does is it raises debt service, and debt service then constrains fiscal space. I think this is sort of the key anchor. And in constraining the fiscal space, therefore, there's less investment available for governments to do many of the other nice things they would like to do, including investing in clean energy and investing in resilience. And in turn, these constraints then reinforce this reliance on fossil fuels and heighten vulnerability to future shocks. So when we look at this debt fossil fuel trap, it really then suggests that the conventional central bank tools that we speak to and the manner in which central banks may need to address the transition within their respective mandates would vary. And for me, therefore, I would actually advance that central banks, at least 3 core propositions for how central banks and SIDS should be approaching the transition away from fossil fuels. First, they need to reposition themselves, see themselves as system-level actors, where you operate at the intersection of monetary policy, financial stability, and sovereign debt sustainability. And I could actually use the example of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago as one of those that, in a way, operates like this, because it is a central bank that operates in an energy-based economy. But it is also a central bank that carries out several functions. One, it is the economic advisor to the government. Two, it is a mega regulator, so it therefore regulates and supervises not only banks, but also insurance companies and private pension funds, as well as what we call systemically important financial institutions. Those are called SIFIs. The central bank is also manages the country's sovereign wealth fund, and therefore it gives it that particular advantage in that interface between domestic and international financial conditions, and is also a key architect of developing the country's capital markets. So here we see a central bank that really has a sort of system level type approach. The second proposition is that therefore central banks need to think about how they could enable a just and orderly transition, because as we know, if that transition is not done in a structured and proper way, there is going to be impact on across society, whether it's on low-income households, whether it's women, whether it's the workers affected in the very energy sector that we speak into, whether it's the rural communities. And here is where inclusive green finance starts to play an important role, and something I'll speak about in the next session on how AFI then becomes critical to this. But what this requires central banks to do is to start to think about how they play this sort of catalytic role in coordinating domestic policy with international financial institutions and the sort of climate financial flows that we're seeking to mobilize, rather than simply being providers of liquidity. Right? And the third then is a discussion that hasn't really started to take place when we talk about the transition side, but it was something that had started on the climate side, where for all of this to happen, particularly for SIDS, we need progress on reforms to the global financial architecture. Whether that is progress on how we access concessional finance based on vulnerability, not on income levels. How do we reform the IMF's debt sustainability analysis, which, as you know, that is what gives you the sort of financing envelope for countries. And if we take the debt fossil fuel trap into account, you see that DSAs don't really take climate risk and transition risk and nature risk into account. And if they do take some of the investments that have been made in terms of building resilience, those investments are treated as expenditure, not as an attempt to help mitigate vulnerability to future shocks. And so therefore, just as I wrap up, really, what we need then from a SIDS perspective and for central banks when we speak about this sort of systemic approach is that central banks cannot enable this transition through incremental adjustments to existing toolkits alone. Instead, they need to contribute to reshaping the very financial conditions under which the transition would take place. And this requires moving beyond this narrow focus where we talk about tools, toolkits, liquidity provision, towards a broader role in how do we help mitigate that debt fossil fuel trap feedback effects that these countries face, and that therefore it binds climate vulnerability, sovereign debt, and fossil fuel dependence all together. And I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Joanna, that was very useful, I think, and very helpful. Just the analytical framework of that debt fossil fuel trap, that cycle you laid out for us, and then it's always good to have three clear propositions. So I think that's very good. The systemic role, the importance of the just transition factor, particularly impacts on people, and then that actually this does require international cooperation and changes to architecture as well. So it's not just something that individual central banks can do on their own. I think that was very, very helpful. Thank you so much. So we're now going to move east, not all the way to China, but I think to Switzerland. Is that right, Isabel? Is that where you are today?
Yes, it's my location. Thanks.
Yeah, very good. So it was fantastic co-chairing this work stream with you, Isabel. Now, China wasn't part of the official governmental process, but in our research track, we wanted to sort of bring in sort of insights and expertise from around the world. So it'd be really good to hear your perspectives, and particularly where experience, particularly of China and central banking and its approaches, sort of complements what we've already heard so far on this panel. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for the navigation. And also, it was a pleasure for me to co-chair the central bank work stream discussion in Santa Marta. And also thanks to you, Kiel, WI, and Lingo's team, everybody who's involved in the initiative and this webinar. It's a very important and timely discussion. Now, thinking about China's approach about green finance, I would follow the popular number here, 3. The key message is the 3 steps to make the green investment economically viable. And rather than just relying on one single policy instrument, the Chinese authorities have gradually built, let's say, an ecosystem in which where this low carbon economic activities becomes easier to finance, easier to evaluate, and increasingly attractive to market participants. So the 3, I would say, steps comes first with defining a shared language and understanding. In the Chinese context, I think Dr. Ma Jun summarized it very well, that he started with taxonomy and disclosure standards when he was still at PBOC and chairing the work there. And this is a very important first step because this provides a common framework for, let's say, the financial sector, the real economy, and then also the regulators. And importantly, this did require extensive coordination across not only, let's say, the financial authorities themselves, like the central bank, but also the other ministries, so that everyone who are working on those kind of transition topics, both from the policy and industry silos, let's say, they could share the same definitions and objectives. So this is a really important, I would say, step 0, kind of step 1. And then the second step, that is really about to create incentives. So once a common framework and language exist, then the financial institutions and also the real economy, they both need incentives to act upon it. So there are 2 examples I think probably would also fit very well to what the speakers has mentioned on 2 sides, on the monetary side and then on the financial supervision side. So in 2021, the PBOC launched the Carbon Emission Reduction Facility. It's just a good example to show that a targeted refinancing operation can also support green lending. And even earlier, about 10 years ago, China's banking supervisor already incorporated green performance into its supervisory assessment framework. And this encourages individual banks to strengthen their green lending and climate risk management over the long term. And now the last part. So when you have all the frameworks established, what needs to be seen is, let's say, when you push the boat into the water, that's the actual implementation. So China has relied extensively on piloting, which means that certain regions, they can start with, let's say, new taxonomies or pilot taxonomies. And this then allows the policymakers to learn what actually works and what has provided enough incentive and where they would need to adjust the existing policies along the line and gradually scale successful practices. So these are the, I would say, very pragmatic 3-step approach that I would summarize on China's green finance on the system level. And more broadly, of course, if you need to kind of do a stock take on the existing policies, in addition to carbon market, there's also a really important piece of work on non-carbon price policies. That is being done by MGF Lab at PKU. I encourage later when the report is out, everybody to take a look. And also great that they were part of the Santa Marta discussion as well and shared the preliminary learning. I think that's a very useful kind of the existing boats that are already floating. And then on Nick, your second question on the relevance of this experience. Of course, every country, I would say, they have their own really specific circumstances. the developmental priorities differ, energy systems differ. Of course, natural endowment also differ. I mean, energy is such a kind of, how do I put it? Sometimes it's really looking at what you have by nature. So here, whether China's experience is relevant is really ultimately for each country to judge. What can be, I would say, transferable are not necessarily the exact policy, but really some of the underlying principles. So, for example, creating shared language between the real economy and the financial sector and the regulators, establishing incentives, and really allowing room for experimentation and then learning. So these are the, I would say, the three most important steps looking at China's approach. And I also see the common interest between China and probably other emerging markets and developing countries being in this, where they have both the need to continue developing while expanding access to affordable and reliable energy. So renewable energy in this case, and also energy storage and electric mobility, they offer new ways to support such type of development. And in China, for instance, we now see those zero carbon industry parks. They support cleaner manufacturing, renewable energy and storage, improving energy access in rural areas that are far away from the urban places, and electrified transport that gradually also reduce exposure to international oil price shocks. So these are the things I would say, of course, in the exact pathways, they would differ across countries. But in terms of the border objective between China and other EMDCs, there are a lot of similarities. Thanks.
Great.
Nick.
Thank you. I think the rule of three kind of works, doesn't it? So I think we should we should keep to that. It's always good. A beginning, a middle, and the end. That's very good. So towards the end of this panel, and I'm glad to see we got some good questions to the coming in on the Q&A. Keep them going. We'll try and answer them. So Kjell, if you want to give your thoughts, we helped pull this process together. I think particularly the pre-conference, the science conference, proved very useful overall in terms of informing some of the governmental discussions which followed. But so add maybe your thoughts, and particularly where this central bank dimension is not an isolated feature, but sort of fits in the broader sort of transformation that Frank was talking about at the beginning, maybe issues around roadmaps and other parts of the agenda. So over to you, Kjell. Thank you.
Shall I try and do it in 3 points as well?
I think you have to now, actually. I think it's a requirement.
Okay, well, okay. Well, glad to be here with everyone, and glad to see so big interest also. The first point is on roadmaps. I think that Santa Marta had a big focus on these roadmaps beyond fossil fuels, and I think this was in part due to President Lula's attempt at COP30 in Belém to get the world to talk about roadmaps, and then the COP process pushed back against it, and then many countries said, we need to do this anyway, and crowded into Santa Marta. And we saw almost 60 countries there coming together. And I think the important question when looking at roadmaps and the Santa Marta process is that it's no longer about if we should move beyond fossil fuels, but it's now about how to do it. And I believe that central banks have a very important role to play in that process in every nation. And I think central banks have technical capacities that are very much needed for having a serious and realistic discussion about how to move beyond fossil fuels, in particular when it comes to macroeconomic analysis. And so we think that central banks should be involved in that conversation on roadmaps. And, you know, you've already spoken about some of these issues. You know, Sarah, you mentioned about the volatility.
I think he's frozen. Is that right?
Oh,
you're back.
I'm back. Okay.
You're back for the second point. Good.
I'm the only one who's not hot, but who's freezing. Balance of payments issues, interest rates, and fiscal space, as Dwala has mentioned, that can actually freeze the transition itself, Those are issues that central banks should be watching and are watching and can bring to that conversation. And I would add to that end-of-life conversations for when we end fossil fuel extraction. There are huge, not only stranded assets, but also stranded liabilities that could create financial instability in some jurisdictions. So I think central banks must be an important player in that process of roadmaps beyond fossil fuels in countries. And we think it's important to start building how they will come to that table, or maybe in some countries even start setting that table for having that conversation. The second point is about the Santa Marta process being a different animal.
Right.
As Frank said, it was not a negotiation. It was a conversation about how we move beyond fossil fuels. And from Lingo's side, we work together with universities and think tank partners to organize the science segment, science and policy interface of the Santa Marta process. And we brought central banking to that conversation, knowingly that they are such an important ingredient, and we will continue to facilitate those intersections. And I think in Santa Marta and in that process, the magic happens at the intersection of different silos. And when you start talking about how it is done, you have to look at many different issues. And so the Santa Marta process has a richness of different angles. For example, the arbitration issue, investor-state dispute settlement, that is one that the lawyers are looking at, but it has important implications for others. Also, health. There was a whole health work stream, and we believe that health can be widened actually to include financial health, a topic that in the context of AFI, the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, has been talked about. And when you look at those intersections, you end up with new questions and sometimes also with new answers. And one of the answers, I believe, is that the direction is towards prosperity. So there is a whole track on zero carbon prosperity that includes those. And I think that those are interesting and new conversations that are coming out of the Santa Marta process due to being so holistic. And then the third point I would like to make is that this conversation of central banks within the Santa Marta process has sort of opened a new door, because we have, of course, seen the conversation about central banks and climate for a number of years, and big progress has been made on certain issues. But in Santa Marta, we realized that actually this is not a subtopic of the climate conversation. This is actually central banking and energy is much closer to the heart of central banking, of guaranteeing stable prices and stability of the financial system overall. So we believe that this is a new conversation that lives in a different space from other conversations that are already existing and have institutional homes. And so with this group, the Smart FSG, we want to cover that ground and complement the work of existing alliances and groups such as NGFS and the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, and work together with them to make sure that we can bring the relevant issues to the fore and work on them to make the transition beyond fossil fuels a success.
Three points well made. Thank you very much. So we've got some good questions coming in. I'm going to try and summarize them a bit. So some good ones coming in. Firstly, from Christoph Kiecinski, I think, from Switzerland. A big question about data and where the data lies. Obviously, central banks are deeply quantitative institutions, rely on a lot of very careful analysis. Christoph is suggesting that obviously some of the data lies outside national levels in private sector, insurance companies and towns and cities and so on. But it's a good question, I think, for people on the panel. I don't know whether Sarah or Jwala, you've been doing some very interesting sort of heat mapping. Where is there sort of, do central banks have the data they need, or do they need to sort of look in different places? I don't know. Jwala, Sarah, would you like to sort of think about these?
Sarah, would you like to go first, and I'll come after?
No, I can go. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Jwala. Actually, in terms of climate data, we have some partnership with other institutions as well. For example, over here in Brazil, you're not the purview of the insurance sector. Differently
Right.
from what Joala mentioned, the Central Bank of Brazil, it's only foreseen the oversight of financial institutions, but not the insurance sector.
Okay.
So we
Yep.
rely on partnership to receive data from other institutions, even from the federal government.
Mhm.
And for climate risk, to address climate risk, what we need is very granular data as well, in terms of asset level data. So this is very hard also to build internally. And we have been doing it for the last, I would say, 5 years, trying
Okay.
to improve our data, the granularity of our data, so we can improve our climate risk assessments.
Super. Okay. Joala, any thoughts
Yeah.
from you on this point?
Sure. Just to add to what Sarah said, and also looking at, there was another question around whether central banks have the technical skills, right? So they sort of come together. And
Yeah.
what is one of the things that really, from a capacity point of view, to me, that distinguishes central banks from governments is that many central banks, I think nearly all, have research departments. And those research departments are obviously staffed with what I would consider to be some of the best and brightest and most capable minds around. And therefore, from that viewpoint of having capacity, technical skills, let's say relative to government, central banks are clearly ahead of the curve to start with. The second now is also on data. Apart from research departments, many central banks have also carved out statistics departments. Right? So there's a whole, because by virtue of what they do, there's a requirement to really have a strong statistical infrastructure. So again, that adds not only to capacity and skill sets, but from a data point of view, they have data and information that generally governments will not have. And by virtue of many of them that regulate the financial sector, they now have data from the financial system that could be used. Now, in terms of how you move forward, is what do we do in terms when we see many central banks lack that sort of consolidated picture of how fossil fuels affect their economies and financial systems. And therefore, it means we now need to move forward on how do we gather that sort of data and then take that data, put it into a sort of practical diagnostic framework, and then translate that into the sort of scenarios and stress testing that central banks are great at. Yeah.
Right. No, very, very good. We're going to take a few more of these questions, but I want to bring you in, Frank. You just produced the report of the framework, and as you said, there's going to be more details provided, the work streams quite soon. And it's good to see the central bank theme sort of identified there. I mean, you've been looking across this finance agenda, and some of the DFIs were in Santa Marta. There's been discussions you've been having with pension funds and so on. So where do you see, sort of stepping back, where do you see this central bank role fitting in the sort of Santa Marta agenda more broadly, as it stands at the moment?
Yeah, thanks. I think that also relates to some of the questions I was reading. By the way, very high quality questions there. So I think very good to try and take that on very seriously. Listen, I think we've discussed the risk side of things, right? So we're talking about substantial systemic risks, the fossil fuel dependency, obviously, the transition risk, obviously. We've been talking about systemic traps, and like the debt fossil fuel trap, and the need for reform. I think that sort of sets a broad stage, but on that stage, nobody expects central banks to be the policymakers. And there's a really interesting thing here is so central banks do have a certain toolbox and a certain mandate. And it is, in my view, very important to create more clarity on what measures and solutions have been taken, are being taken. I'm sure a lot is happening around the world to respond even to the short-term crisis, but also taking into account the long-term crisis. So to create more clarity there, I think that's a very, very important task ahead of us. But I also think there's a challenging task to advance our joint thinking about these matters. So where do we say the previous paradigms, like the example was given on the IMF, but there are many paradigms here on managing financial stability where we basically could argue that the transition that we're discussing and we're looking at and we're keen to be smart with, it challenges us on those paradigms. So what is the way to think about this, and how can we? But I think the final point should not be underestimated. The central banks have a different role from governments. So what discussions, dialogue should actually take place between central banks and governments, between, let's say, people who work from a mandate of supervising systemic risks, much more the long-term undercurrents of the finance and economic systems, versus the somewhat more short-term measures that governments are often concerned with. Where you could have short-term cycles of adding certain green incentives or removing green incentives or changing policies, also in my country, right? So policies are changing. As policymakers, we generally work with a very short-term horizon. So how do we bridge that gap in perspectives and let's say the type of dialogue that we should have to be more effective in managing this discussion? I think that's a challenge that we really need to dive into. Related to that, as with all communication, communication is always easy to understand what you're saying, but it's difficult to see who is actually taking the meaning out of your words. So language matters, and what language, what words do we use? How do we frame these things? How do we make sure that we're effective and we don't just keep running around in the same circles we've been going over many years, but we actually are able to connect these different perspectives in a meaningful way. So I think I do see a lot of work ahead of us with this group and with the challenges that are on the table. I don't know if that answers your question, but at least it does resonate with me that that we have a serious task ahead of us.
No, very, very interesting. And I think particularly I think as we've been revealing in this discussion that actually certain paradigms are being challenged. I think you were pointing to the question from Delton Chen, who was with us in Santa Marta. So good to see you, Delton. And I think he's raising this issue of, is there this tension between sort of fixing the climate problem and the financial stability issue? And I suppose, as you were underscoring, Kjell, that actually the fossil fuel dependency is obviously related to the climate issue because it's the same substance, fossil fuels, but is a slightly different issue. And is there a sort of what's the amount of synergy between the mandates of central banks and contributing to climate change, and where there are differences and so on? So I think he's asking for, is the work we're thinking of here primarily financial stability, how much it's actually thinking about contributing to the goals of the Paris Agreement, for example. So I don't know who'd like to maybe pick up on that. Jwala, Isabel, Sarah, Kjell. I think it'd be good to get your thoughts on that question from Delton.
I guess I could go first since you called me.
I did.
Yeah. Just okay. No, just following through from Frank's comments there, and I think, and yes, I think the group has recognized that it's a long, difficult, challenging road ahead for us from the discussions that we've been having for the past few months. But if I just wanna, Nick, if I could just stick with the trees again, like
Please do.
three things that I think the group we need to do amongst many of the other things. One, of course, is listening and co-creating. I think that's important. The fact that
Yep.
we need to have this sort of structured dialogue with central banks, financial regulators around the world, including the developing countries and SIDS. And that is really to understand their specific mandates, because the mandate is what is central and core to how we move forward on the
Yep.
transition challenge. Issues around data, issues around institutional constraints, and really what they see as policy priorities. And
Right.
therefore, that sort of discussion that we just had there around synergies, right, between governments, central banks, between climate, nature, and transition, all that sort of comes in that initial piece. And I think here's where the
Yep.
Alliance for Financial Inclusion, I think, is really important in terms of the sort of collaboration and partnership that the group could establish, because AFI really, I think, offers an important platform for how we move ahead. AFI, as for those of you who may not know, the Alliance for Financial Inclusion brings together central banks and regulators from emerging and developing economies. It has a strong experience in peer learning, which is extremely critical to what we're talking around. Financial inclusion, but so far that has been focused on climate, and really some very practical policy recommendations and implementation, simply because it's coming from within the central banks themselves.
Right.
And therefore, how I see it is a partnership between our group and AFI could help ensure that the transition and financial stability agenda is grounded in the realities of these countries. As you know, we've already sort of started that exploratory discussion with AFI, and we intend to build on that even more. But also want to flag as well that, given that Isabel is here and she's the expert, she could talk a little more. I think there's also the importance of the China renewable energy story for lessons across the board, whether we talk about the global north or whether we talk about the global south. I think that Eastern story is extremely important. Yeah. And then really is around, secondly, about then how we move towards a number of lighthouse pilots, given what we've been discussing. The pilots might include something like a fossil fuel dependency assessment, transition risk, stress test, supervisory guidance, and maybe a pilot in a SIDS, I think, would be extremely valuable, because it shows how you could start to approach this debt fossil fuel trap that I talked about. And just finally is always, since we named after Santa Marta, is how we connect the central bank work to the wider Santa Marta agenda. Recognizing, of course, and I think this has to be said, I mean, central banks cannot produce the just transition on their own. That's not their responsibility. They're not even responsible for energy policy. I mean, that's what we have to, that is how it works. But the analysis that comes from the central banks could help inform the national transition roadmaps, fiscal planning, energy policy, industrial strategy, and international financial arrangements in support of TAF. So I'll pause here.
Thank you for those three. The second you got three, it's a bit like a sort of tennis match, isn't it? You sort of have three balls, three balls, and then that was really good. And I think you really captured the spirit of this Santa Marta Transition Financial Stability Group, which is really, it came out of a research track. It's very research based, really to listen, really to understand. And I like the focus on piloting. And I think maybe, Sarah, you got your hand up already, but I was going to think, particularly for you in a central bank, the sort of things where this group could work in a sort of productive fashion with a central bank like Banco Central de Brazil, and where the international cooperation could be particularly useful. But please come in now.
For the benefit of central banks in general and financial supervisors, not only the Central Bank of Brazil, I see a primary priority for the group is to define credible transition pathways to support the development of prudential transition planning. I say that because prudential transition planning is a paramount a strategic risk management tool for regulated entities to support an orderly transition.
Yeah.
However, for this plan to be effective, it needs to be guided by credible pathways that account for current geopolitical fragmentation and its direct constraints implementing green policies.
Yeah. I think this is a really, really interesting point. And I was discussing actually with another central banker that a number of institutions now, regulated commercial banks, but also real economy companies, have been developing transition plans. And actually, quite a good research question is, has those transition plans, which have been focused on emissions, have they given these institutions greater insight about the dependence on fossil fuels? Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. But I think this focus on the prudential transition plans is an area really for, I think, some really serious work. So I think that would be a good one to focus on.
To start, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good area, and again fully within mandate. Isabel, I think China was mentioned in was it number 2 of Jwala's number 3? I can't remember. I lose count now. But particularly again, maybe your thoughts about where the People's Bank of China, the central bank, is going in the sort of current macroeconomic environment, and what you see happening next, particularly in terms of further decarbonisation that's coming along.
Thanks, Nick. I think it's a great, I would say, segue also to say that many people on the panel or in the question section has asked the general role about central banks and their mandate, how they operate, and the environment where they operate. And I think this is particularly relevant for China because, let's say, a big part of the world at the moment are really facing rising prices or potentially even higher prices in the future. And China is in a really different picture. So
Right.
the PBOC now is operating really, let's say, in almost negative or just barely positive price trends. And this is under, let's say, the pressure of the oil price shocks.
Yeah.
And that naturally then gives, let's say, a very different setup for the PBOC to navigate compared to ECB or the Fed. And in this context, I would say the green transition is not really a separate or kind of parallel policy agenda. It really sits alongside broader objectives.
Right.
And I would say on the aggregate side, definitely not only PBOC's like immediate goal, but the whole, I would say, policy-making goal is to support domestic demand. And strengthening energy security, of course, is reinforced by this year's oil crisis. And then at the same time, looking at, let's say, those new sectors as new growth engines, like, for example, the new energy sectors, they promote productivity. And at the same time, they foster a new different source of growth. And this, I think, is an interesting story where very often our conversation stays within the energy sector. The next question is to ask, when the technology becomes viable, what type of, like, let's say, value chain, supply chain is developed along that? And this is particularly useful for a lot of other emerging markets and developing countries, because this means then you can start to vision industrialization based on renewable energy. And this is, I would say, extremely relevant for other emerging markets, also for China, in the sense that the next stage of financing will be different compared to the renewable energy itself. So for the policy tools I mentioned before, so for example, for the TRO, so the carbon emission reduction facility, there's already some policy news saying that there will be an extension of the scope. So the economic activities covered by that facility will be extending to other transition fields. So that's one area that I think is particularly interesting. And of course, some of those measures, indeed, they fall, let's say, far beyond PBOC's own not only willingness to act, but also ability to act. So sector-specific, let's say, regulation or investment into national grids. These are the areas where they could support, as outlined in, for example, in the energy sector, 15th five-year plan. But these are not the area where they would say, we issue one guidance and then job done. So that's a bit more, I would say, coordinated effort ahead.
Okay, and there's a particular question from Susanna Belmonte as well. I don't know if you saw it. Do you think the green TLTROs in China or based only on the central bank mandate, or based on political will, obviously, or a combination of two? Any response to Susanna's question specifically on that?
It's a great question, and I think it also fits into our discussion very well when we're talking about central bank mandates and also, let's say, the general government policy. So in the Chinese context, I definitely would say it's a combination of both the central bank's mandate, which includes to promote economic development and growth, and then another part is this dual carbon goal. So I think there is this, I would say, aligned vision, both from the strategy of a national development and also one key policy institution's own, let's say, toolbox and their own vision. So that's, I definitely see as one of the reasons why green finance was able to start in such a pragmatic way to go forward.
Right. Okay, and I got a question here, I think directed to you, Jwala. I think you've raised this issue about debt sustainability analysis from John Sward. IMF currently undertaking a review of its LIC debt sustainability framework. Any particular comments on that approach and TAF, which beyond what you've already mentioned?
No, thanks, John, for that question. And similar to to what we've been asking in respect of the IMF reform and its DSA, in respect of climate. And well, they haven't really talked about nature in particular. I think it's a similar request on when we start to talk about the transition challenge. That one, you need to incorporate transition risk into the DSA. And two, you need to incorporate transition investments into the DSA. And therefore, that would give you a totally different picture, not only of what the debt sustainability profile of the country looks like, but also what is the sort of financing envelope that is now available to this country. And I think key to all of this, and I think is part of some of the questions I've seen, is that, and the work what this group is, how we treat in transition, is that it is macro critical. And therefore, if it is macro critical, it is of concern to central banks, whether it is a central bank concerned only about, let's say, on the inflation targeting side with a narrow mandate. We've shown how transition risk has an impact on price stability. Or whether it's a central bank that's concerned with broader development concerns, you show how, again, transition risk could manifest all the way down, not only past financial stability, but as Kel mentioned, on stranded assets. And there's also a longer term consideration to have. So I think it's key that the work of this group and how we approach this is around macro criticality of the transition challenge.
Very, very good. I'd like to pick up this question of biodiversity as mentioned here, and I think sort of maybe that's broader nature and other sort of, I suppose, key resources, water. And certainly in the discussions we had in Colombia, again, Colombia relies a lot on hydropower for its electricity. It came across that Colombia very heavily reliant on coal and oil and gas exports and so on. So moving away from fossil fuels, but then becoming more reliant on hydro. That, in the first iteration, that sounds good and more reliant on renewables. But then if you have climate impacts and you have impacts on your hydro capacities, it creates a sort of another dynamic. And again, as you were saying, Sarah, the energy matrix of Brazil is is historically very clean, very heavily reliant on hydro. But again, on the nature side,
almost 60% relies on in hydro. It's very high.
But then there are impacts on water and drought and so on, and obviously super biodiversity.
Yes, we have already seen rising frequency of seasonal droughts and, for example, intensified by climate change and the El Niño phenomenon that you mentioned before. And what we have been doing here is trying to diversify our electricity matrix. It needs to be not only clean, but also needs to be diversified. Otherwise, you're going to suffer from the physical risk impacts of climate change.
Yeah. And any more reflections on that sort of biodiversity nature agenda? Because clearly, I mean, Brazil is a super biodiverse economy. Nature issues, risks it's the foundation, nature is the foundation of your sort of bioeconomy, as it were. Any more reflections there?
Yes, I can say is that the Central Bank of Brazil tackle climate change, but not exclusively. What we do, we tackle in combination with social and environmental risks, and we have been doing that since the beginning. Even before the Paris Agreement, we already had regulations related to rural loans in terms of their impact on the environment since 2008. So it's a long way. And we have been doing it in combination, especially for being a developing nation. A rich biodiversity country is quite important to address them in combination. For example, the NGFS is about to release a supervisory framework, and it's already embedding climate risk into nature.
Very good.
As we can see, biodiversity, the ecosystem services provide climate regulation. So climate risk could be perceived as belonging to nature.
Right. Yeah, that's true. No, very interesting. And again, sort of my friends in the global north in Europe think that all the good ideas come out of Europe. And I have to tell them, well, Brazil was the first country who was thinking about the environmental implications of the Basel framework. And as you say, it goes back to 2008. So I think we need to recognize where the innovation comes from. It's not just in the North Atlantic by any means whatsoever. So it's really good to highlight that. We're coming to the end. I just wanted to turn to you, Kjell. I think there's been a very interesting dynamic now, and I think as you were framing it, sort of recognizing that clean energy obviously is cleaner than fossil fuels. It's a solution to climate change issues. It can have cost advantages. It can have decentralization advantages, but it has the sort of system stability dimension. And we've been reflecting, haven't we, this of what could a sort of stability enhancing sustainable investment portfolio, because there are these positive spillovers from clean energy now. I don't know if you have any reflections on that, and then we'll start sort of winding up.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, actually, I wanted to respond to that point of that Djwala made, that you have to look at the investment side also, because if you think of financial stability and transitioning beyond fossil fuels, and compare that to a soccer game, you can't win it with a defense alone. You have to go forward and you have to score some goals as well. And I think that is about the investments. And that is interesting also for central banks. You have to be proactive in a sense in making the transition happen, building the prosperity based on renewable energy, so that you're no longer prone to fossil fuel shocks. And so this is a team sport, and it's played between governments and central banks. And if you are arguing, oh, this is for the defense, or no, this is for the attack to deal with, you're not playing yet. You actually have to play together and pass the ball. And I think that is something that we hope to unlock in the context of Santa Marta. So for the governments, bringing the central banks into this roadmaps and transition conversation is very, very attractive, because as we have seen in the Chinese example, if central banks say, oh, we'll differentiate between green investments and all the rest, or the brown, then suddenly the financing renewables becomes much easier and much more attractive, and then the whole financial system does it, and central banks can unlock that, but they will need the mandate from from the government to do that in the first place. So it's everybody has to be there at the table sorting out how to do it. And on the other hand, for central banks, if you want to solve fossil inflation and these price shocks and improve stability, you have to invest in renewables. And I think financial inclusion is another point where thinking that from a renewable model bottom up, we've seen it in Pakistan, how it happened without intervention top down, and I think it can happen in many countries. China has huge capacities of building more renewables that could be used out there in the world for the transition, but the financing is a key question that is holding things back, and how to unlock that is an important issue. So I think that's I guess the point I want to leave you with. This is a team sport, and central banks are one of the star players in this team potentially, if we manage to set it right.
I don't want to speak for other members of the panel, but you're speaking to a very sad member, Englishman, and probably a very sad Dutchman and a Brazilian woman, all these footballers. So anyway, let's start winding up. You've got your hand up, Sarah. Maybe some closing thoughts, and particularly where next, as I think you've been highlighting the fragmented nature of things. How do we sort of move forward with determination on this agenda? Your closing thoughts, please, Sarah. Thank you.
To build momentum on this agenda, I think the ultimate priority must be operational execution, driven by international cooperation among a diverse set of actors. For example, to just name just a few, central banks, financial supervisors, broader policymaking authorities, MDBs, national development banks, and scientific and technical experts. An orderly energy transition requires closer and more agile coordination among monetary, fiscal, industrial, and prudential policies. If I'm allowed, I just want to make a quick comment regarding central banks' mandates. When you look at the core mandates of central banks is price and financial stability, but there are some nuances. For some central banks, for instance, People's Bank of China, they integrate sustainability into their mandates. That's why we see that some central banks tackle climate change and the transition risks and physical risks a bit differently from each other, because their mandates, they are not the same. As Joala mentioned here, his mandate was completely, from I could say some points, different from our mandate over here, the Central Bank of Brazil. So they can boost, for example, sustainable finance, but in our case, we cannot. We can only do it in a risk-based perspective. So I think it's very important to highlight this difference between central banks' mandates.
Yeah. But I think that's really important. I loved your focus on operational excellence, and with that diversity, there's still scope for international cooperation. So I think that's really good. Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to turn to you, Frank. I think what was so interesting about Santa Marta, in a sense, it was the first significant international response to the crisis. There's some of the existing sort of fora where we would expect a response like the G20 didn't really come forward, and so Santa Marta, I think, was quite significant for that, both from a climate perspective. Obviously, this broader question of the uncertainties and destabilization we've seen because of fossil fuels and so on. So, thinking forward, where do you see this agenda going in the next 6 months as you start your process of handing over to the next co-chairs, Tuvalu and Ireland?
Yeah, thanks. I think what you mentioned is, I think you're right. You're right to a big extent, but the Santa Marta dialogue started from a group of basically ministers of energy, ministers of climate, ministers of environment, ministers responsible for economics, informed by a very large stakeholder group that I think brought a very rich discussion. Like was just said, so I think Kjell also referred to that. During the process, there was a strong call to bring the financial dimension in a much bigger way into the conversation, and you did a fantastic job to bring the central bank perspective into the discussion. I think we've accomplished that, right? So next step is, can we then move as this dialogue is continuing, both on international dimension as well as in the countries that are, of the mindset to actually do something and willing or keen to take measures. How do we turn this to granular messages and in particular actionable messages? I do take, and I find Sarah's suggestion very challenging. If you think along the lines of coordination platforms that strengthen international cooperation, but also bring around the table central banks, MDBs, DFIs, and broader players, how do we actually do that, and how do we get there? My observation is that there is work to be done, because that was not the starting point of this dialogue. Those were not initially the people around the table. We also had to work hard to get the MDBs and DFIs around the table. They did not always feel comfortable to discuss these things, but they indicated to say, hey, we have a very sizable toolbox and we have a very big commitment to support client countries. So
Yep.
can we create the platforms to take that dialogue a step further? I think the ultimately the trick is in bringing that together. So thank you for the challenge, and I don't have the solutions now, but it's like Kjell, I don't believe in defensive tactics here.
Right.
And our defensive tactics have made me sad. Like yesterday, I was also not particularly pleased. So I think there's a lot of work ahead if we can take on these challenges head first.
Super, very good. So no more rules of three. We have to have a football metaphor, I think. So Jwala, to you, just your closing thoughts, please.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think for the group, what I think is important is how we use this Santa Marta momentum to show how the transition away from fossil fuels can strengthen, not weaken, price stability, financial stability, financial inclusion, and long-term economic resilience, recognizing that, of course, central banks cannot finance or manage the transition alone, and they should not be expected to determine energy policy, but they do have a broader systemic role, and particularly in ensuring that the financial system is prepared for an orderly transition. And and that is along many of the lines that we've talked about, but in particular, we there's always a discussion around the finance moving away from fossil fuels, but less on where should this finance be moving towards. And I think that's the story about the investable pipelines that I think is key, and to show already that central banks are actually serving the broader macro critical mandates. Thanks.
Very good, very good. Isabel, to you, your closing reflections, please.
Very quickly, and I think already you have covered really important grounds. I would say just in the time when we are, let's say, given the task to do better diagnosis, we should not forget that these should be always translated into practical action. And that, of course, need to be taken in all, let's say, specific contexts, both in terms of developmental priorities, such as, for example, this rising sovereign debt, for example, as well, and within the institutional setups, including the mandates. So I would definitely say I look forward to the next round of the discussion and look at the policy proposals that come up in each economy. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you so much. And then, Kjell, you started this footballing metaphor. Are you going to score a goal now in your final remarks?
I think I'll break out of that frame now and say this is a journey that will continue. No, I'm also a very sad German looking at that. I think this journey will continue and will be engaging at the Alliance for Financial Inclusion that is coming together in Papua New Guinea in a couple of weeks, and we will go to Guangzhou, where colleagues are looking at the zero carbon prosperity framing and how the Santa Marta countries and China intersect and can work together towards that goal of prosperity. And then we'll at COP31, we will certainly be talking about how the Santa Marta process and the UNFCCC interact. And then next year we will have a pre-conference in Ireland that will surely have a central bank component, and then the next conference in Tuvalu. So this conversation will continue. I think, Frank, the challenge is there. We've had a good turnout today at this webinar, so I hope that we will be able to bring many of you into this conversation, each bringing their piece to the puzzle. And I think there is a lot of work to be done, and I'm looking forward to keeping this conversation as constructive as it has been in Santa Marta, as it has been today, and going forward as well.
Well, thank you, Kel. Great working with you. Thank you, Sarah, Dwala, Isabel, Frank, really for your time and your commitment. I think what I leave with this is a commitment to listening very carefully and understanding the specific roles of central banks in very different contexts. I think, as we've heard, I like the phrase operational excellence, focused on that, and international cooperation. Sarah, the granular and actual messages, data came up quite a lot. And then, Dwala, I think this strategic sense of using this moment to show that action away from fossil fuels, but crucially towards a successful, prosperous, orderly economy, can strengthen financial stability, price stability, and financial inclusion. That's really good. And then this notion of pilots, which you had first raised, Isabel, but I think you highlighted as well, that we actually start looking at practical applications. So, apologies as chair for taking a bit more of your time, but hopefully it was worth it. And look out for further events that will be happening from the Santa Marta Transition Financial Stability Group. Our next focus is really sort of deepening this agenda in particular regions or countries, but also in particular areas of the central bank agenda, such as the transition policy. So thanks for staying with us, and we'll send out a recording very, very soon. So thanks to my colleagues who organize this, and good afternoon, and may the best team win.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.